limits, man. Whoa. Okay, calm down.
Ben, I want to have you to talk about lots of different things, but I thought that we could start out talking about Saudi Arabia because we actually did a show on that last week. And one of the things that you did a deep dive into was kind of the real reasons that Biden went to Saudi Arabia. And through this deep dive, which I recommend, you also get into the characters of Mohammed bin Salman and Jamal Khashoggi. So tell us why, in your opinion, Biden really did what he did in Saudi Arabia.
Well, everything that the U.S. government is doing these days is because of the new Cold War. This is something I know that you and some of your guests have talked about, Katie. We're clearly in a new Cold War, the second Cold War. There's differences, of course, between the second Cold War and the first Cold War. One of the differences is that it's not only against Russia, but also against China. So when we see the U.S. government make any major foreign policy decision, it's all about this new Cold War. Before I came on, you were talking about Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan, which is extremely provocative. It's essentially one step before the U.S. recognizing Taiwan as an independent country, despite the fact that when the U.S. normalized relations with the People's Republic in 1972, it recognized that Taiwan is part of China. That was the only reason that China agreed to normalize relations with the Richard Nixon administration. These so-called three communiques, these agreements that were signed in the 1970s, made it very clear that the U.S. recognizes Taiwan as part of China. So taking a visit only to Taiwan, not to the mainland, and meeting with Taiwanese officials is effectively saying that the U.S. recognizes Taiwan as a separate country. Extremely provocative. So that action can't be separated from the proxy war on Russia that we see in Ukraine. The U.S. is fighting until the last Ukrainian in order to bleed Russia. We saw Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and former Raytheon lobbyist. He said that very clearly, that the U.S. goal is to weaken Russia, as he said. And then finally, this trip to Saudi Arabia, it has to be situated in the same context, right? There are a lot of people talking about oil, and certainly oil is a part of this. Oil prices are very high. And one of the main reasons that inflation is really hitting the U.S. hard and the entire world pretty hard is because of very high commodity prices. It's not only because of energy prices, it's also because of the sanctions on Russia and the war in Ukraine. It's also because of COVID and supply chain issues. But one of the most important factors for high inflation is energy costs. So it's certainly true that one of the reasons that Biden went to Saudi Arabia was to try to pressure Saudi Arabia to increase its oil production, which would increase the supply of oil in the global market, which would mean that the price of oil would go down, which would help to contain inflation. But that's actually not the main reason. Even The Guardian, certainly not an anti-imperialist media outlet, The Guardian published an article that was based on discussions with Biden administration top-level officials, and they acknowledged that the Biden administration's thinking was they're trying to make sure that Saudi Arabia stays firmly in the U.S. camp and doesn't lean toward China and Russia. Because what we're seeing around the world right now is many countries are not going along, especially with this conflict against Russia, right? So the U.S. has been pressuring countries with which it has very good relations, and which you could consider allies, like India, for instance, or Mexico. The U.S. has been trying to pressure them to put sanctions on Russia, and they have refused to do so because they continue to buy cheap oil and gas and wheat and fertilizer from Russia at prices that are below market value. So the U.S. is trying to pressure all these countries that are traditionally its allies, like the Gulf monarchies, to make sure that they stay firmly in its camp. And Mohammed bin Salman, I mean, he's a brutal figure. I'm not in any way, praising him or saying that he's like, sticking it to U.S. imperialism. That's certainly not what's happening. Of course, the U.S. is still supporting Saudi Arabia in this borderline genocidal war in Yemen. They've killed more than 377,000 Yemenis, according to the United Nations, which is probably a conservative estimate. So I'm not in any way saying that like MBS is like a great anti-imperialist leader, but like many leaders around the world right now, MBS is trying to play the East against the West, right? Erdogan in Turkey, which is a member of NATO, is doing exactly the same. Erdogan just took a trip to Iran and met with the leader of Iran and Vladimir Putin in Tehran, which is, of course, like, the neocons' nightmare. So all these countries are basically trying to play the U.S. on one side against against Russia and China on the other side to do what's in their best economic interests. And Saudi Arabia is a very clear example of that. We've seen that Mohammed bin Salman has forged pretty close relations with Russia. He's been buying Russian weapons and military equipment. He's been buying Russian oil, ironically, because Russia is selling Saudi Arabia oil at contracts that are below market value. And then Saudi Arabia is selling its own oil in the spot market and making more money. So it's actually profiting because it's importing the oil it uses from Russia. So basically, Biden went to Saudi Arabia and basically was telling Riyadh, look, you've been a traditional US ally since the 1930s. You need to be firmly in our camp. You have to pick a side, stop cozying up to China and Russia. Basically, we're in a new Cold War and we're waging a war pretty much directly right now on Russia. I mean, the U.S. has troops and not troops. The U.S. has special operations forces and CIA agents inside Ukraine on the front lines of the fighting. So it's pretty much as close as it can get to a conventional war with Russia without boots on the ground. So the U.S. is going around the world and telling countries, look, you have to be firmly in our camp. We're not going to allow you to keep playing both sides like this.